Hello and welcome to another session of Groundbreakers Live. I'm your host Javed Mohammed, and today we're very honored to have with us Derek Weeks, who is famous for his research in DevSecOps. He's a DevOps evangelist, and he's got a very long bio, but for brevity, I'll keep it short. Derek, welcome.
Thanks, Javed. It's good to be here. Good to be
Yeah,
here.
absolutely. So, Derek, you're presenting at DevNexus. I think your title of your presentation is Machines Making Software. Sounds a little scary. Paving and maintaining the road with zero trust open source. So,
Yeah,
how did you come up with the idea for this?
yeah. It's a good question. First of all, I want to say this is my fourth year, and I may have lost track. It could be fifth
Uh-huh.
year that I've presented at DevNexus. I'm a big fan of the conference, going every year and presenting when I get papers accepted, and I seem to have gotten a couple of papers accepted. It's just a high quality conference overall. So I really appreciate everything that you guys do to put it on. In terms of the talk, it does play into a number of these other talks that I've given over the years, and as part of that, one of my roles at Sonatype is each year I produce a annual state of the industry report called the State of the Software Supply Chain Report. And I also produce another annual report called the DevSecOps Community Survey. And as part of this, we gather a lot of data about what's going on in the industry, what different organizations are doing, what some of the best practices are, what some of the risks are within these environments. But the title of the report, pointing to machines making software, plays into some of the research around that we've been doing in the past couple of years. For the State of the Software Supply Chain report, in the last 2 years, I've partnered with Gene Kim. Many of you know Gene from his work in the DevOps community. He wrote the Phoenix Project, the Unicorn Project, the DevOps Handbook, runs the DevOps Enterprise Summit, et cetera. And I've also partnered with Dr. Stephen McGill, who is CEO at a company called MuseDev that's also here in the Washington, D.C. area with me.
Uh-huh.
And we were looking at how software development gets done, and especially how software development teams are using open source components, packages, libraries, frameworks,
Mhm.
uh, in order to build the application environments that they're responsible for. And as part of this, we spent some time dissecting software supply chains.
Mhm.
And part of that is we knew developers were using a ton of open source components uh, to build their applications. But we also understood that not all of those open source components were created equal. Some had different license types, some had known security vulnerabilities, some were super old versions where sometimes 30 or 300 newer versions of a component existed.
Mhm.
So we wanted to get an idea of, could we figure out different or study different attributes of those open source projects and that code and figure out who were the best projects with the highest quality code?
Mhm.
And if we could figure out the best projects with the best quality code, and software developers were effectively bringing in those open source projects um, as parts that were being used to assemble applications, much like managing traditional supply chains, using the best suppliers and the best parts from those suppliers, software development could do the same thing. So if you take knowledge of the best parts from the best suppliers and you bring that into a software development practice, you can start to inform developers, hey, you're using a part that's got really good quality from a great supplier with a great track record, or you're using a part that has a known defect in it and isn't that well respected in the community and has some troubled history. You want to avoid using that. So developers could then build better software. Well, as you know, in the DevOps community, software development is accelerating, and we're trying to make certain choices or get feedback faster on different elements of software development that we're doing.
Mhm.
If we take the information about the highest quality parts from the highest quality suppliers and we begin to codify some of that information in the development process, we can rely more on machines to help us pick the best and highest quality open source projects to use within our code. And therefore, machines can be building more and more of the code that we're going after. Right now, like the state of the art today for most developers is, why did you pick that open source project to go with?
Mhm.
Well, I've used it for years, or all of my friends use it. I've used the same version for the last 4 years. It doesn't introduce breaking changes. I know how to work with it. I'm happy with it. And it's kind of more on word of mouth and popularity versus really an academic rigor applied to what makes a really high quality component and a high quality project to rely upon. So, like other things in DevOps where we're codifying practices, we believe that using this data from this research, we can begin to codify more choices of the best open source components and bring those into application development. That's part of what I'm sharing in this presentation. And I'm not saying that in the presentation, hey, this is going to happen today. Um, but I'm saying we're at the beginning stages with having this data
Mhm.
of machines being able to help us build more of the code that we're responsible for taking to market as developers.
And what kind of time horizon do you see? So, you obviously you mentioned this is the beginning of it. So, is this something? I mean, what's your take on that?
Yeah, so in terms of horizons, I think they're always hard to predict in software development. But
Hmm.
I think that we've seen a massive wave of adoption
Hmm.
in the last 10 years of open source packages and binaries being used in development.
Hmm.
For example, I joined Sonatype 7 years ago. At that time in the Java development community, Maven Central, which serves all the open source packages for Java developers around the world, saw 13 billion download requests
Wow.
7 years ago. 13 billion for about 10 million Java developers on the planet is a lot. Today, or in 2020, there were 350 billion download requests. So that's literally more than 20-fold increase in 7 years. So
Hmm.
more Java developers are using considerably more open source than they were before. So open source grows in popularity, but we know that the quality of each component and project is not the same.
Hmm.
And we're at the beginning stages of having the data that can influence the decisions and start to be codified. And I think in the next 10 years, we're going to see a lot more of developers saying, here's the functionality that I'm looking for.
Hmm.
What choices do I have in the market for getting the best components from the best suppliers or best projects to serve that? So in a way, similar to, I go on Amazon and I want a new sweater, and it says, okay, Derek, here are all the different suppliers and the different star ratings that they have. In a way, so I'm doing that kind of review manually. We can teach our machines to say, I need, a web application framework. What is the best web application framework or a cryptography library out there from the best suppliers? And I'm going to have the machine make that decision to bring in the best component from the best project and the best version of that
Hmm.
project, where we can begin to assemble more of these up front. They know which projects work the best, which versions work the best, which have the fewest breaking changes, etc. And we can save a lot of work for developers in that realm by having that selection helped by machines um, as we move forward. So I think in the next 10 years, you're going to see a lot of changes there based on the new entry of this data and the ability to start codifying more of these decisions.
Okay. You spoke about security vulnerabilities, and I guess there's been attacks on the software supply chain.
Yeah.
Any comment about that?
Yeah. So, you know, in the realm of application security that touches on what developers are doing every day,
Hmm.
uh, we we used to be at this point specific to open source packages where new vulnerabilities are discovered by security researchers.
Hmm.
And then we try and inform the open source community as fast as we can, generally through word of mouth,
Hmm.
that this vulnerability exists and people should upgrade. And we saw that with OpenSSL. We saw it with struts and the whole Equifax,
Hmm.
um, scenario that played out there, and hundreds of other open source vulnerabilities that have appeared over the years. Um, but the for adversaries, it's a very inefficient model that you basically have to sit around and wait for a vulnerability to be discovered. And then when it is discovered and announced, then the race is on to exploit it faster than the organizations can fix it or update to a newer, safer version. So because you have to sit around and wait for these things to happen, it's very inefficient. But the adversaries have figured out, hey, Javed, just like you and I are contributing to an open source project, they can contribute to the same open source project.
Hmm.
And if you pick a project as an adversary that's getting 100,000 downloads a week or a month, um, that's very popular, and you contribute malicious code into that, and you and I don't happen to be security experts and don't notice that Jane over here is contributing some code that has a backdoor in it,
Hmm.
that gets released out, consumed by 100,000 organizations in the next week or month. And Jane has effectively created a 0-day that can be exploited by her because she knows where that is and how to go about finding it. So adversaries have shifted upstream within software supply chains to start using this attack vector more. In my research, between 2015 and 2019, there were about 200 instances of these kinds of attacks that were noted in the industry. From June 2019 until May of 2020, we saw 900 of those kinds of attacks.
Wow.
So
So stuff.
effectively, from a 4-year period having 200 to a 1-year period having 900, we saw a dramatic increase in this style of attack as a new efficient attack vector for adversaries to use. And we've seen these and continued to document them. It feels like every month there is a new attack. And just earlier this month, we saw some adversaries contributing malicious code into Maven Central, into an open source project there that was trying to mimic the names of some very popular projects out there. We recognize these. We were able to recognize these vulnerable packages. We were able to remove them from Maven Central so people didn't download them. But the adversaries are looking for newer, more crafty ways to get malicious code out there and to have people download it. And so we all need to be more aware of what we're consuming and the quality of those components that we're consuming, knowing that the adversaries are continuing to innovate on their end. At the same time, we're all trying to innovate on our end for different reasons.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks for sharing. So we talked about perhaps things to avoid and some of the darker side of things. Let's kind of switch to the more positive side thing. I mean, like, what are high performance software organizations doing? You've done all of this research and everything. Can you just share
Yeah.
with us a little window into that?
Yeah, it's fascinating research of what we've stumbled upon. One, in the data that we've collected from our interviews and surveys with different organizations. Um, but one of the things that we're seeing is uh, the high performance organizations are actively controlling their software supply chains. They're understanding what they're consuming in terms of open source components, even containers, infrastructure as code sometimes that they may be downloading, various Terraform plans, if you will, all of this coming into their organization from uh, outside, built by others. They're examining those things. In terms of open source components, these organizations are, one of the things that we saw that they are doing is they are updating their open source packages, including the dependencies on those packages on a very regular basis.
Mhm.
Um, Sometimes with every release, sometime once a week, once a month, they're making it a regular practice to go through these updates. And as part of that, they have higher quality components, packages, and dependencies in their code. Um, and they also introduce fewer breaking changes as part of these kind of regular updates. It's easy to update from you know a package 1.1.1 to 1.1.2 because it may only introduce two breaking changes. But if you are on 1.1 and you want to upgrade to 1.9 or 3.1, there could be 46 breaking changes, and that could be very painful.
Yeah.
So the people, just as DevOps is kind of accelerating these small, fast iterations in tiny bits and chunks, we're also seeing the same kind of practice happen in the use of open source components. And those that are doing this as a result, and other practices, we're finding are not only um, uh, accelerating software development. So there are teams that pride themselves on being fast. These
Mhm.
high performers are even faster. And there are teams that pride themselves on being secure, maybe not that fast. The high performers are also more secure than the security conscious and faster at the same time. So there's a big benefit that's coming from being fast and also being more secure as a result of these practices. And the final thing that I'll add is these developers in these organizations we're seeing through our data are also happier in those organizations that are doing this. So it sounds like, man, updating open source components and dependencies and all the versions all the time in every build. Wow, that sounds like a pain. It's actually more painful if you only do it once a year as a practice because it's a heavy lift versus this is just the exercise that we do every day kind of experience. So that's some of what the evidence I'll present during the conference on. Here's what we're seeing the high performers do versus the lower performers or security minded organizations.
All right. Well, Derek, it sounds there's a little scary parts to it, but there's a lot of excitement around it, and so
I
uh,
have been known to scare some people during the presentation unintentionally, but
all
it's all helpful. You got to know
absolutely.
this stuff if you're
All
going to
right.
change any behaviors.
All right. So, Derek, I wish you all the best and thank you for sharing.
Javed, thank you very much.